Hello and welcome to this short webinar on the Senior Manager Certification regime. Here we cover the limited scope firm requirements, and this is in association with our short guides that we have published, which give practical planning points that you can take away and apply to your business straight away to comply with this all-encompassing regime. It's important that we take a look at why we're here with the SM&CR. And really it's a decade in the making with the financial crisis and the mis-selling and the dysfunctions of the retail financial service world. There's been a lot of FCA focus on two key areas really, which is competence, knowledge within the businesses, within the firms, the organisations, and also conduct, which is behaviour. So that will then focus really on producing a constructive culture and governance process, and increase and strengthen accountability. So really firms now, you are the regulator in this regard, and you have to regulate your own individual people within the business to ensure that they've got the right roles, the right responsibilities, the right skills on an ongoing basis. It's all been part and parcel of the FCA business plans as well, and as mentioned really, the firm now has full responsibility to self-regulate. The SM&CR, in our opinion, is the most personally impactful pieces of regulation to hit the financial services industry in decades, and it's a move away from the approved persons regime, and the new regime aims to reduce harm to consumers and strengthen market integrity by making individuals more accountable for their conduct and competence. The FCA hopes to achieve this in two key areas. That's firstly, encouraging a culture of staff at all levels taking personal responsibility for their actions, and secondly, making sure firms and staff clearly understand and can demonstrate where their responsibility lies. So a little bit like this particular slide, what we want to move away from is a blame game culture into one of high accountability and responsibility. This timeline gives an idea of how far we've come down the track with regard to the SM&CR. In 2015, it was looked upon as extending it to all regulated firms. In 2016, it came into play with the banks, and now has moved through to insurance firms last year, and moving now into solo regulated firms. So all regulated firms will be under this regime by December 2019. The FCA have a firm checker on their website, and really this just gives an idea of how that works, and really, by now you should be familiar and know what type of firm that you'll be classed as and what responsibilities you need to employ. But it's also worth rechecking just in case you're unsure. So what we're going to do is break this down into three key areas. Firstly, we've got the senior manager regime and the issues that arise with this. So this is all about, as mentioned, it's having the right people with the right skills and the right roles with the right responsibilities, and it's looking at key areas around senior management functions, who are the senior managers in your business, any statements of responsibility that they need to employ, and allocation of what's called prescribed responsibilities. Now the good news is a limited scope firm, you will not have any prescribed responsibilities. It doesn't apply, but it's good practice to actually apply and know them in your business, because it's all about those two key areas about knowledge, competence and conduct behaviour. So when we're looking at practical planning points here, it's important to mention that you need to know who does what within the firm and who has responsibilities across the two compulsory areas, which is compliance and money laundering, and how that maps across to the current approved persons regime. So really it's about mapping roles across the functions, and also designing statements of responsibility. So what does the senior management function have to do, and making sure that that's documented, and it's an easy to read document. It's not a job spec, for example. It's a bit more granular than that, and it's kept up to date. So quite simply, where we're looking at the limited scope firms, we have three key areas to focus on, which is compliance, money laundering and distribution of responsibilities. When we move through to the second area, which is the certification challenge, there are key areas here are, certification functions and how they apply and how they can be cross-referenced against the approved persons regime, who to certify and when, an annual certification. Now, the important thing here is also to mention that there's a key crossover with MiFID II on what's called information givers. So if you have people within the organization, or you outsource to people like paraplanners or client relationship managers, for example, who have intermittent relationship with your clients, then they can be classed as information givers, and they may have to go through a certification process. But it's important that you flag that up and you know how that plays out in your business. So when we're talking about certification itself, well, firms are now required to identify employees who might cause significant harm to customers and markets and assess them as fit and proper. And this means that it's the firms themselves, as you mentioned, who are accountable and obligated to self-regulate and ensure that they have the right policies and procedures in place to assess this and prevent any harm occurring. We break this down into 7 key areas and design a certification lifecycle for you so that you can apply this straight away to the business in this particular planning point. So here we've got the first area of knowing which staff require certification. I mentioned those information givers might come into this, and ensuring that they've got clear role descriptions. Secondly, you need to be assessing fitness and propriety. So fit and proper status comes into this in the initial assessment process. Then you need to look and ensure that you've got your annual certification process in play. You might want to mirror your current process that you have. But the problem with that is that we've got a 9th of December start date effectively, so you might want to prorata it around that process. Next, you've got really identifying and considering conduct issues, and we'll cover this in more depth when we talk about the conduct rules, but it's important that you blend this into the certification life cycle process that we've got here, so that you ensure that you know what the conduct areas are, you know what you're going to do regarding breaches, you know what reasonable steps you need to take, which we'll talk about in more depth in a minute. Then we move through to training and conduct and making sure that aligns with the regulations and designing and implementing a clear and training competency plan. Then we're moving through to recording all issues across the breaches we've talked about regarding conduct. But breach reporting is going to be very, very important for the SM&CR, and making sure that you are walking your talk around taking reasonable steps to stop them and address them. And then finally but not least, you've got people leaving a role. It could be short-term sickness or maternity, and the reasons are documented. It could be long-term or permanent. There is a 12-week rule under the SM&CR where if someone leaves a role, then you have 12 weeks really for that to be filled, and then for someone permanently to come in and overtake that role, or the original individual to come back in and continue in that role, and it's all documented accordingly. Moving through to the conduct rules, the final area. Well, on conduct rules, this is really about fit and proper requirements, and that's about the recruitment selection process that you have, obtaining relevant qualifications for the individuals. They've undergone or undergoing training. They possess the right level of competence and personal characteristics that they've got. You've got all the regulatory referencing, the criminal checks and civil checks, offence checks in place, and you've really got an overall assessment process that is fit for purpose within that. And when we're talking about planning points, well, here we've got the first most important area to look at, I guess, is the 2 tables on the right, which is about the 2 tiers of the conduct rules. Firstly and foremostly, the first tier you should be familiar with anyway, which is looking at acting with integrity, due care, skill and diligence. It's looking at open and collaborative behaviour and relations with regulators, paying due regard to customers and treating customers fairly, principles, observing proper market conduct standards. And the second tier is really focused on the senior managers in the sense of reasonable steps, and the first 3 areas, which is taking reasonable steps and controlling business activity, in complying with the regulations and delegating to appropriate people. And then finally, but not least, you've got to disclose appropriate information to regulators that they should reasonably expect. And then what we've designed here as a planning point for you is really looking at designing an employee life cycle, because conduct rules are all about, as we've mentioned before, about behaviour and culture. So it really is, it's looking at the overall journey, if you like, of the employee life cycle. So first and foremostly, looking at recruitment, where job descriptions need to be tight, watertight to the roles, reporting lines need to be clear, identifying senior managers and certification staff, conduct risk elements, making sure that any individual is appropriately registered on the new directory, the FCA directory, and handover requirements are in place, and delegation is all documented. Training, competence on conduct rules and how to apply roles, check attendance on the training and competence records. All staff performing roles that involve or are connected to financial service activities need to be trained in how the rules apply to their roles. And auxiliary staff who have no requirement to be trained are identified. So that can be, receptionists, cleaning staff, security staff, or whatever, people who don't necessarily need to be certified or go through the conduct requirements. Then we move on that really to looking at understanding role change promotion, which really is important to looking at revised assessment, senior management updates, standards, statements of responsibilities, the cultural impact of anyone new coming in, approval process and absence, planned or unexpected, looking at that 12-week rule and deputy arrangements that you may want to put into place, assessment and appraisals, ongoing consistent and fair appraisals, competencies evidenced and monitored on an ongoing basis. Then on performance, we're really focused there on measuring and improving it, and you can actually employ personal development plans. You can use diagnostics to do that, to evidence it. Disciplinary processes, really ensuring legal procedures are in place and consequences are screened. The senior management allocated the conduct rule prescribed responsibility is responsible for ensuring the firm meets the requirements. Well, although prescribed responsibilities aren't applicable for limited firms, it's important that the senior manager knows what they need to do in and around disciplinary processes, and it's probably good to have some form of understanding of the prescribed responsibilities that the other two-tier firms need and require. Absences, log the reason, whether it's maternity, sickness or whatever, look at the 12-week rule, how that applies and who will take over. And then exit and termination, looking at any legal requirements, any consequences, any handover, referencing and FCA notification processes that need to come into place. When we're talking about the reasonable steps, it's really a duty of responsibility for senior managers to ensure that they're taken in case of breaches across the conduct rules. And here we're talking about, the FCA expects senior managers to ensure that the business areas are controlled, that they comply with the rules at all times, and that tasks are delegated to suitable people. And they will determine breaches across statements of responsibilities, responsibility maps, even though they don't apply to limited firms, firm behaviours against statements of responsibilities, for example, and evidence-based practice, so everything is documented. And then looking at relationships between, in the business, if you like, to make sure that they're all functional. The steps that senior managers need to take is that, they need to have clear objectives for activities and risk limits, clarify roles and responsibilities and decision-making processes. Training and competency requirements need to be in place, and then it all needs to be understood, and looking at their legal and regulatory obligations. Steps when taking new responsibilities need to be documented, and risk registers and breach logs need to be in place to document what's going on, and corrective evidence needs to be evidenced. So, it's not good enough, for example, if you receive information and you don't respond to it, to the red flags. So, you need to be taking action and evidencing how that action is taken. Any committees that you employ, any meetings are minuted and actions are agreed and management information is reviewed, and obviously you're delegating to the right people in the right place with the right skills, as we've said at the start of this webinar. So finally but not least, taking action, things to consider. Well, you need to be considering, as a limited scope firm, what senior managers apply to your firm, and does your firm have individuals who will perform the relevant senior management functions, as we've talked about, and who needs to be assessed under the fit and proper requirements, and who needs to be certified, and how that can be done on an ongoing basis, and which certification functions will apply. Remember that issue about information givers. That's very important to factor in. Which employees need training under the conduct rules, and what reasonable steps are required to take in case of conduct rule breaches. Finally but not least, we operate a RegTech platform called Model Office, and Model Office is designed to take a look at key areas like the SM&CR, provide a benchmark against where you think you are, and then provide any strategies, steers, tasks, resources, templates, so that you can continue to improve based on any gaps in knowledge, any gaps in actions and behavior. You can find out more about that on our website or email us on that email address. And also, you hopefully will have received your short guide, which also covers all the information in this webinar. So thank you for your time and watching today's short webinar on the SM&CR for limited scope firms.